All right, we've got folks from all over the country, which is very exciting. And yes, very sorry for those who are farther east and dealing with what us Angelinos typically have to deal with most years in terms of the smoke. But we are so grateful for your willingness to join us on a Friday afternoon to talk a little bit about transparency in compensation. So my name is Lucerito Ortiz. My pronouns are she, her, hers. As I mentioned, I'm based in Los Angeles, California. And I am a proud member of the Promise 54 team. At Promise 54, our tagline is that we help adults to thrive so they can do their best work. And ultimately, we support mission-driven organizations in any kind of talent or DEI practices and work to really set the conditions for us as humans, as professionals, to be able to show up as our full selves and to be able to sort of really find fulfillment and see ourselves honored and valued in the places that we live and work. So a couple of things about me. One is I'm the proud daughter of immigrant parents from Guatemala and Mexico. I was born and raised in Los Angeles. This is where my parents met, so it's definitely home for me. And my Latina heritage alongside my geographical heritage means that I am very obsessed with lime hot Cheetos. It is something that is very core to things that bring me joy in life. So that's a little bit about me. I'll pass it over to Jamie to introduce herself.
Hey, y'all. Jamie Grimsley here, she, her pronouns. I'm an associate partner at Promise 54, and some of the ways I identify, I'm a white woman, a bitter Southerner, somebody who believes in being part of a better, more inclusive South. I am from East Tennessee. That's where I'm joining you from in Knoxville. I'm the mom of a 15-month-old and a mini golden doodle named Dolly, who is named after one of my all-time favorite humans and singers, Dolly Parton. And part of what brings me to this work is that I am the first person in my family to graduate from college. I'm coming to you as a former high school biology teacher turned policy nerd. And prior to joining Promise 54, where I've been for the past 3 years, I spent some time at the Tennessee Department of Education, working primarily in the human capital space, which included compensation, which is part of the reason that I am so excited to be here to talk to you all about this today. So I'll hand it back to Luce to tell us about what we're going to do today.
Thanks, Jamie. So great to connect with y'all. Thank you for receiving us and receiving a little bit and hearing a little bit more about us as humans. We know we're in a bit of a sprint today, so we're going to do a very quick hit on some key concepts on compensation transparency. So at a high level, we want to think about what pay transparency might entail or look like, and think about some of the risks and benefits that come along with that. We want to invite you to think about where your organization is along a transparency spectrum, and then think about the conditions necessary to support greater compensation transparency. Thank you. And so we'll jump right in.
All right, y'all. So we wanted to start by just kicking off a little bit about what do we mean when we say transparency and compensation. And when we think about transparency as a principle generally, right, it's the degree to which we're being intentional about visibility into how our systems operate. And so when we think about why we might bring visibility into our system, we know that it can support employee clarity, and transparency, right, will also give us this lens into how we might build equity, because it's going to help surface for us any potential gaps in how our systems are being experienced or perceived. And so one of the things about compensation is that it feels pretty high stakes at times, which means that we want to be intentional about the transparency that we're using, right? We don't want to be sharing random things about compensation in a way that is unintentional or not strategic and thought through, that folks may get upset, may not understand where any of it's coming from. So when we think about this idea of transparency and compensation, we've got some ideas, but would love to invite you all to join us in the chat, and would love to know, what do you think of when you hear transparency and compensation?
Yes. Mhm.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Seeing some things come through: integrity, risk, sensitivity, clear decision-making guidelines. Okay. Ooh, Michelle, thanks for tapping into that. Made me nervous at first, but we didn't. It felt good. Krista, see you honing in on clarity. Ooh, Jose, I like that. A clear min-max range for roles. Public accountability. Thinking about how this is an opportunity to garner trust. Seeing some people noting publishing salary bands, right? Seeing some clarity on salaries, opportunities for raises and increases. Ooh, Laura, getting into thinking about communication so that folks can access things. This is great, y'all. These are all really phenomenal answers. And when we think about the big takeaway here, right, is that transparency and compensation is more than just the actual money folks make, right, as evidenced by these wonderful things that you all put in the chat. And so one of the flags before we move, right, is like transparency is not necessarily equated to clarity, right? It doesn't, just because your system is transparent doesn't mean that people have clarity within it. It's important for our systems to have both. And so when we think about going through these various components that you all have listed and some of the ones that we're going to talk about, would love for you all to begin thinking about how we can think about using that through line to create clarity for our folks as well. So you all just put some of these things in. What are some of the ways that transparency shows up, right? It is actually salary information for our existing employees, but it's also how folks are placed in your system and how they move around in that system. If we think about how salaries are adjusted year over year, is this cost of living increases? Is this a merit-based increase, right? Do you offer bonuses? To whom and how much? It's so much more than just thinking about the actual numbers on the page. And when we think about publishing those salary ranges is a great way to think about transparency and compensation. But other ways that we want to think about our system as well is how we benchmark information, thinking about how do our salaries compare to similar organizations and similar positions, using pay audits as a tool to determine are there any gaps in how we're compensating people by identities, by roles, right? And then lastly, we want to think about pathways. So we want to think about when folks enter the system, folks that are currently there, how do you grow? What happens if you move into a new role? What happens if you're going in the same role? And so there are so many ways for this to look. And so what we wanted to go ahead and pose, though, is as we think about and grapple with all of these components and the ways in which we talk about bringing clarity into our systems, would love to just offer and ask for folks to weigh in here. In what ways do you think transparency can support equity and compensation? Would also love for folks to drop some initial thoughts in the chat. Thanks, Jose, for being the first mover here. Removes ambiguity. Absolutely. What else? How do we see this threading into equity? Angela, surfaces any bias? Love it. This is where the thread is going now. We're keeping an eye out for bias, ensuring some groups are not paid less for the same roles. Amy, heightening awareness of pay inequity. Yep. And the perception that that gives us. Oh, Laura, thank you. We're giving the same information to everybody. Oh, and leveling the playing field. These are great. Keep these coming in. I'm just scrolling through and hope that you all can too. We're empowering folks to advocate, creating visible pathways. All of these are great. A couple of the other things that we were thinking as we were prepping for this conversation about how we see this thread is like, this is going to build greater inclusion within your organization, right? Your staff is going to potentially lead to being more satisfied as a component of this. It's going to increase trust within the leadership. And as you all noted, is going to give you all the tools to close those pay gaps and inequities that folks see. So one of the ways that we think about this, which is key, is this idea that transparency is actually a spectrum. And so when you think about our entire system, right, it's not per se that we're thinking about it in this binary that we've shown here, but it's really moving across, and it's all going to be dependent on the different components within your system. We just showed you all a bunch of different ways that transparency can show up, and based on the different ways in which you have operated and invested time in those, you may see those levels of transparency actually varying within your own systems. And so a quick, easy example of this is like, you may publish your salary bands for your existing employees, but it's not super clear how you place new hires within your compensation system. And so the thing to keep in mind as we're moving into this discussion around transparency on this spectrum is there's no like right place to land. It depends on a variety of factors, your organizational culture, your values, your capacity to be able to support these things. And what we want you all to consider, though, as part of this conversation is what are the risks and benefits as we think about transparency and these different levels that we're going to engage in. So I'm going to hand it over to Lucirito to take us a little bit deeper into those.
Yeah, so sometimes it feels a little weird to talk about, well, what are the benefits of not being transparent? Because what we're talking about is transparency is connected to equity, so we should be more transparent. However, if there were no true benefits to a lack of transparency, then more organizations would be much more transparent. So we think it's really important to also ask the critical question of who does a lack of transparency benefit and how, right? So if we take an example of the risks and benefits of different levels of transparency for salary ranges, for example, right? So let's say we have an organization that is not at all transparent in its salary ranges, meaning it has no public or published information to its staff about current salary ranges for different roles within its structure. The benefits here could be that it protects a leadership team from potentially hard or tricky questions, or it protects them from having to explain compensation conversations or decisions, right? So they can make decisions as they wish, which is perceived also as more agile, right? Then if we don't have to explain or hold ourselves to this consistent bar, then we actually have much more flexibility to respond to different things we might need to respond to, right? Different market conditions, or maybe there's this one candidate that feels really exceptional. We want to be able to move them up, or one person we know is at risk for attrition. We want the flexibility. So it's perceived that like if we don't have to be transparent about that, we can be more flexible and more agile. And it also increases hiring manager or talent team autonomy to set and determine compensation. Again, because you're not having to explain or publish or make any of this information public. So those are some of the ways in which a lack of transparency could benefit certain individuals within an organization. The risks, however, are it perpetuates a culture of, we don't talk about money, which very much increases the risk of and instances of inequities across multiple indicators, race, gender, position, etc. It creates a lack of visibility into systems and decision making, and that disempowers people from being able to ask critical questions about the why behind their compensation, or to advocate for themselves within that structure, and or advocate for each other, right, and their direct reports. And because there's no need to explain decisions, that upholds power and control, and it does not actively build trust, right? You're not supporting that sort of culture of honesty, transparency, and radical candor within your larger organization. I'd be curious to hear if there are other risks and benefits that you see when you think about a non-transparent salary range system, meaning maybe there are salary ranges, but it is not public information for your staff. And feel free to drop those in the chat. A risk of attrition can be higher. Definitely, Elaine. Thank you for that. Krista, definitely. I think we've seen a lot of research demonstrating that the outcomes and experiences of negotiation are very different across lines of race and gender, primarily benefiting white folks and men much more than BIPOC folks and women or non-binary folks. Laura, I like that elevation as well. Without that transparency, then staff can build a lot of narratives around and assumptions around the why and how of compensation. Keep them coming. These are all really great flags. But I do want to move us when we think about the other end of that spectrum, right? So if we think of an organization that does have published salary ranges for existing staff, there are a lot of benefits that many of you have already surfaced when in talking about how transparency can support equity, right? It supports conditions for trust, it supports accountability, increases understanding across team about, where they fall and why. But there are also a lot of risks. And this is, a lot of the risks is what holds a lot of organizations and teams back from being able to lean more fully into that transparency. And the risks are that making this information public requires upfront and regular alignment across leaders, HR, people managers, both around the what, like what the system is, and the why, right? Like why people are placed where they are, being able to align both on the placement, but then also being able to communicate and align and have buy-in around the rationale. People need to be prepared to answer questions about how the system works and the rationale behind it. And that also requires support like down the cascade of leadership, right? So most people are going to go to their direct manager first and be like, why is this? So you need to be able to prepare all of your managers to engage in some tough conversations, because sometimes people, may not align or may not be happy with the rationale or the answers, and managers have to have the skill and the information necessary to navigate those conversations, as do leadership teams when faced with those questions. So similarly, I'm curious to see what other risks and benefits you would see to an organization publishing salary ranges for its existing staff. Thanks, Jody. And I think Jody's comment, I think that could be both a risk and a benefit, right? If it's market-based, it helps employees understand where they stand relative, not just to the organization, but to the market. The risk there is, what if you're lower in the market than you want to be? Like, that's going to come with a lot of questions or frustration. The benefit is, it gives the organization opportunity to engage in that conversation. But also, if you're higher in the market, you can communicate that effectively as well and say, like, here's where we fall, we're trying to remain competitive, and here's how we're able to live that out. Krista, the risk is people may see inequity and that causes tension among colleagues. Yeah, like the more information you have, the more questions that are likely to arise, not just of leadership, but between staff as well. Laura's raising a good point here that having more information about where you fall within a range, for example, if I know I'm lower in a range, it might motivate me to try to negotiate my salary up if there's not a policy against it, right? Then you might have an influx of folks trying to like, okay, but how, like, I want to be higher in the range. Why am I not higher in the range, right? Right, these are really, I know we have to move for time, but these are really great thoughts. Thank you so much. Please be sure to read your colleagues' thoughts in the comments. There's some really great trade-off, like weighing the trade-offs here. And these are all the types of considerations that I know organizations are trying to grapple with when figuring out how do we move toward greater transparency in a way that is sustainable and effective for our staff, right, and for our culture. But I am curious to hear from you all where you would place your own organization. So I know we're inviting a bit of vulnerability here without judgment, but if you were to think about your organization's compensation system as a whole, where would you place it on the spectrum of transparency? And so we want to invite you to use the annotate function. If you go to the annotate option, select a stamp where along the spectrum you think your organization as a whole would fall on the compensation transparency spectrum. Man, we've got a lot of spread. All right, we've got some folks that are way on the high end. We got some folks further on the lower end. I'm curious to understand, regardless of where on that spectrum you fall, which components of your compensation system currently would you say are the most transparent? Where do you see the most transparency, relatively speaking, in your organization? Okay, so it seems like salary ranges are a pretty common area to have the greatest transparency. Posting your roles with salaries. Okay, thank you for sharing. Yeah, all right. Okay, let me delete these. Thank you for that. Okay, so now looking at the flip side of that coin, we're curious where within your compensation system would you say do you have the least amount of transparency, or which aspects of these would you most want to move further along that transparency spectrum? If you were to select like your top two in terms of priority, which of these components? And if it's a component that's not listed, feel free to drop it in the chat. So you're going to use the stamp function again to select which components you'd most like to see more movement, or drop a different thought in the chat. All right, we're seeing a cluster around transparency of structures and opportunities for promotions or raises, a cluster on salary placement factors, greater transparency on why people landed within a salary range. Got a couple of folks wanting to make salary ranges more transparent, some benchmarking. We've got a yikes on information about existing employees. Very fair. All right. So again, I know this requires some vulnerability, so thank you for engaging here. But as you think about what feels hard organizationally about moving these factors forward on the transparency spectrum, What organizational conditions or factors do you think are currently might act as barriers to increasing transparency on these particular aspects of your system? What's getting in the way? And I'm going to drop this in the chat. Culture. Let's say, would you be willing to elaborate a little on that? What about the organizational culture feels prohibitive? Risk aversion. Hmm. Right. So far I'm seeing three or a couple different comments around the things that are like risk aversion or fear based, right? Like concern around like, do we have the capacity, or are things going to become litigious? What's the risk that we invite by making information more transparent? And then we've also got some cultural components of like, this is the way we've done it, or like the challenge that comes with change management or shifts, cultural shifts. At this point, I'd also like to invite a couple folks to come off mute and share what you see, not just in your organization. You don't have to only speak on your organization if you don't want to, but what other kinds of barriers or challenges you see in becoming more transparent with regard to compensation.
I can share. I actually consult with organizations, sometimes even with Promise 54 back in the day, around how important this is. And I have since created my own organization. So I know the importance. And that like fear scarcity part can be very real. And so, I have published salaries on my website in terms of ranges. When I'm like asking someone if I can profile for them for something, I let them know how much they could possibly be making with it. But I get nervous about like getting a much more like structured thing that I could be transparent with, because what if next month we don't have the same kind of business, or and so I know that's all going out of my head, and it's still really hard to let go of.
Right. So this it feels like the minute you put something on paper and make it public, your ability to change it decreases significantly, because if you're going to change it, there's a lot more people you have to manage that through that change than just being like, okay, I'm gonna behind the scenes, I'm going to change it, right? Okay, so that agility piece feels like a big factor. Thanks for sharing, Laura. Any other folks?
I guess I'll just, I'm hoping that you can address like what happens in an organization where salary bands are published and they do demonstrate like a big range, right? Like pretty high, and then, not below market, but just like a big difference, right? Based on what you would pay a junior level staff, early professional, and then, a senior leader who has a lot of years, and you live in an urban market where that's just what people get paid. So I'm curious to know, like, is that fear real that a leader has, that what if people know their salary? What happens?
What a great question, Michelle. Jamie, I think I'll move us to the tips, because then we can sort of engage a little bit more back and forth dialogue. And so I was about to say, like, this isn't necessarily a checklist and we have check marks next to it. Here are some things, just naming that. Here are some different things that we think can help to support transparency and compensation, including navigating some of those gnarly scenarios where it's like, okay, what if I publish the range and now my direct report knows that they're in the bottom third of the range? Like, and so there's a couple of components that we think can help support and mitigate for some of that risk. That's not to say any of this is ever risk free, right? Or that it's ever just going to go perfectly. But some of the things that can help to mitigate for that, one is aligning on and publishing within your organization on a compensation philosophy. And this is a central value statement that your organization aligns on and develops to state, here is what we want to value and reward in our organization. So it could be like something around, we want to reward exceptional individual performance versus we want to reward loyalty and commitment to our organization. Versus, these are not mutually exclusive. These are just examples of the kinds of value statements that you can make. We want to reward, relevant experience or exceptional previous performance, et cetera. And that sets a foundational direction for, therefore, what you base your compensation decisions on, right? It's a very different system that you build if you want to base your compensation decisions on individual performance versus years of like tenure or years of experience or something else, or all these other factors. And so aligning on a compensation philosophy helps to set a foundation to then pressure test structural decisions around. And it's something, a North Star that you and your organization can point to say, we foundationally most value, internal equity and competitiveness in the market. And those are the two things that we're going to try to make true in our system, right? Second is to clearly define the criteria around what factors are included in your compensation system and how they influence place movement. And this becomes particularly important in the scenario that you're posing, Michelle, which is like, okay, an employee knows they're in the bottom third. If you have a clear sense for the why, and that is consistent across the organization, that can help manage employee expectations. They can also understand, the top, like most people are not going to reach the top quarter of this role band because that's for internal growth. And I came in with fewer years of experience. So I know that placed me lower in the range, right? But that criteria has to be clear and consistently applied in order for that rationale to land with an employee. Because if an employee says, well, okay, you said you counted years of relevant experience, but like I have more years than that person and that person's still making more than me, like it's still not going to resonate, right? So that's why it's like defining that criteria clearly and then ensuring that consistent application. So that can be through a calibration process, meaning that managers get together to calibrate on where people are in the ranges and making sure that that makes sense according to the criteria laid out. And it can also be through equity audits, right? So like on an annual basis or some kind of regular basis, conducting an audit on where are people falling within ranges, and do we see any gaps or inconsistencies, particularly along demographic lines, right? Particularly along range of race or gender, et cetera, because that helps support that equity. But if you're clearly defining your criteria and the why of like where someone can be placed up front, they're going to better know what to expect and not be surprised when they see where they fall within that range. And additionally, it's like part of that transparency is being really honest about what the ranges mean. So as an example, at Promise 54, we break up our ranges into quartiles. Actually, we break up our ranges into quartiles. But the top end of the range is we reserve for internal growth. So it's we would not hire someone external into the very top end of our range. And so when we publish a salary range in a job posting, we only publish the range that they are most likely to be placed in, not the full range, because we know that someone coming in is not likely to be in that top end. And so that's part of us trying to be honest about what might your salary actually look like. And then we have very clear criteria on which of those quartiles you then fall in based on, you know, your level of autonomy within your role, et cetera. So a lot of those questions and frustrations around why am I not at the top end of the range often, I won't say they ever completely go away, but they can be very effectively managed by setting out the criteria and making it public so that individuals can better manage their own expectations of, oh, okay, it makes more sense why I would be on the lower end of this range because I'm not, you know, I'm not an XYZ thing in terms of the criteria, or I am, and, you know, and then it makes for a more productive and focused conversation when they are asking those questions. There's specific rationale that leadership and managers can point to. And it also gives employees more specific tools to advocate for themselves, right? If they then have a disagreement on the application of the criteria, again, that conversation is much more focused and applied, and a little bit easier to resolve than to just say, like, you know, there's a broad range and people are kind of scattered all throughout without really rhyme or reason. And it makes it a lot harder to hold on to, you know, someone's placement in that kind of context. Jamie, I'll let you continue. There's a couple more items and then, yeah, sorry, there's a couple more items. I'll hand it back over to you.
No, you were rolling it perfectly into this, which is like, you can lay all of that out, y'all. But what we know and what we've seen is like change management for any system, especially when it gets high stakes, really hinges on designing like intentionally thoughtful, clear, consistent, and accessible communication. And so thinking about like, do folks know where to go to find this information? Do they know who they need to ask, right? And so when we think about building out your communication avenues for this, we want to think about like a two-way flow. So it's not just about how you're giving information out, although we know it's critically important to create multiple touch points, especially as you're thinking about ensuring understanding and clarity, but also making sure that folks know where to go when they have specific questions about what's happening. If there's somebody that they want to go advocate to understand more about why is my salary falling in this place in the range, and why is it maybe not here where I thought it might be, right? And being able to have that space for folks to do that. And of course, that's actually dependent on everybody who's going to be talking to folks about this, right? Whether this is HR, people managers, different leaders in your org, everybody needs to have all of the information and clear expectations about what is being shared, so that the message is the same. And so when you think about that consistent application, we also want to be communicating consistently about it as well. And that upfront alignment from leadership, from your HR teams, from your people managers is really important when you think about sharing that out with them, identifying any potential gaps, and then you can follow back up and provide that support, and also create and close those gaps in the communication. And then lastly, I think one of the biggest things is maybe even something that's going to get like a little bit of what we would call an adaptive challenge, but like make talking about compensation a regular part of your practice. Think about how we can embed these conversations into, for example, our onboarding system, right? How often are we having these conversations potentially as it relates to our performance management system, right? Are we only having compensation conversations when people come into our org, or when they tell us they're leaving because they're not making enough money? That means that we're not disrupting this culture, that this is not something we talk about, which has the potential to keep those inequities in the shadows. And we want to really disrupt that taboo and make sure that as we codify and clarify and build more transparency, that we're also building additional opportunities into our systems for this. And as Lutherita said, this is not a silver bullet. It's not that if you do one of these things or all of these things that it directly translates into clarity and equity, right? Like there are going to be different things that will work for different organizations differently, right? And ultimately, you will want to make sure that the things that you're doing are aligned with the values of your organization. Pausing to see if there's any questions. All right, y'all, I'm checking the time and we're coming right up. So I'll move us into just hitting some of our key takeaways here as we want to just reiterate highlighting what you should be thinking about as you're thinking about this transparency and compensation, right? Transparency is about creating this visibility into your systems. However, keep in mind, visibility in and of itself is not going to automatically mean that things are clear or that they're equitable, right? There are going to be other steps and potentially other things to put into your system to ensure those outputs. Transparency is about more than just salaries. It's these processes and considerations for how you're thinking about how you pay folks, right? How they move around the systems. I'm thinking about especially with what folks elevated as places where they would love more, and just noticing that like the trends from this webinar, a lot of folks are moving into this idea of we're going to publish salary ranges, or we publish this, or we publish that. Less folks are seeing like, I don't have clarity on like how promotions are done. How is my salary adjusted over time, right? And so as you think about taking this in, this is one way, thinking about those other processes, that we start to create additional transparency. And so with that, this is where all of these components differently and bringing some intentionality to those components and being thoughtful about them will shift that overall transparency of your system, right? And again, not all of your components may be highly transparent, right? There is a time and a place and several nuances that you all shared that you would want to talk about those risks and those benefits for potential parts that are specific to your specific organization or the market. And then lastly, we love to think about transparency as an output. As you think about increasing transparency in your system, that is like the end game is creating this. So then what are the conditions and what inputs are going to help you get there is one of the ways that we would love for folks to be thinking about this concept. All right, y'all. That is officially the end. We're coming right up on time. And with that, we want to just share an opportunity. If this has sparked your interest and you would be interested in partnering with Promise 54 for some more tailored support, you are welcome to scan the QR code. We will be dropping a link in the chat, and you can use that to schedule a free consultation with a Promise 54 team member so we can talk further transparency and comp with you. Yes, as Luzarita mentioned, we will be on for another 15 minutes of the Q&A. But before we do that, if you have to go, before you go, we would love for you to give us some feedback on today's session. You can use that bit.ly. It will be dropped in the chat, but we would absolutely really appreciate and adore the feedback that you could give us about what went well and things that we could shift for next time as we think about this Equity in Action series. All right, if you are not going to stay around for questions, you have a wonderful weekend, hopefully a long weekend for some of us. But Luzarito and I are going to hang here and would love to invite folks to stay around for some optional Q&A. Thanks, y'all.